Welcome. So in this video, we're going to be covering the basics of nParticles, right? So the first thing you want to make sure of is you have your playback speed set properly. So you can go down here to this guy with the gear, okay, time slider, and just make sure that your playback speed is set to play every frame and your max playback speed is set to free, okay? If you want your computations to be correct, you have to have these settings. Okay. And the reason for that is once I start creating particles, it will create a particle and then Maya will compute for what happens to that particle every frame, right? So if this is not set correctly, there's a chance it will skip frames. And because you're skipping frames, the computation therefore is not correct anymore. Okay. And after that, you have to make sure you're in your FX menu set. So if you go up to this drop down menu here, go to FX, and here is where you can see nParticles. So if I click that, the menu opens up, and this is where you have your nParticle um, tools and controls. Okay, so we are going to ignore this for now. These are legacy particles. These are um, this is the particle system that Maya used to use before nParticles came along. Okay, that's why they're called legacy particles. So we won't be using these guys. Okay, so we'll be using these guys and some of these. Okay, so nParticles, right, and then emit. So I'm going to create an emitter. I click that. You'll see it creates three objects: an emitter, which is this guy right here, the particle itself, nothing showing up because we don't have particles just yet, and you have the nucleus, which is this one. So the emitter is the source of your particles. That's where they're coming from. The particle is the particle object itself, and the nucleus is the solver. Okay, so that means this is the one that actually does the computations for your particles. And this is also where you set the rules for what's going to happen to your particles. Okay, if I click play, you see these white dots. These are your particles, and they're just falling straight down. So why are they falling straight down? Because in the nucleus, I have a gravity set to 9.8. If I set that to 0, oops, 0, and I rewind and play again, you see now they go out in different directions. None of them are falling down. Okay, that's because gravity is off. Okay, so this is what I mean by this is where you set the rules. Gravity, there's wind, you can set the wind speed, right? So it's going that way, too strong, maybe just a 5. Okay, and I can set the wind direction with this. So I want it pointing up a little bit and completely up. I can set the wind noise. Okay, because remember, when you're talking about a simulation, you're not actually setting keyframes on the particles. You're setting parameters or rules, and Maya will just do the computations. Specifically, the nucleus will do the computations based on the rules that you give. Okay, that's how a simulation works. You can animate these, of course. So let's turn off wind speed. There we go. right? So I can set a keyframe, let's say wind speed at frame 50, key that, and at frame 115, this goes up to 8, and then at frame 65, it goes back down to 0. Okay, and I can add some more frames. There we go. Okay, so you can see you can animate your rules to change over time. So like in this case, I turn the wind on and off, right? So let's just try putting some noise. That's a lot of noise. Okay, let's break these connections. There we go. And let's turn the wind down again. Wind noise down to 0. So it's just coming out like that. So first thing, you have your emitter, and you can do your edits here in the channel box, or if you press Control A, you can do it in the attribute editor. Same thing, right? There are a lot of settings. You'll notice this with a lot of things in Maya, but you don't have to worry about all of them, at least for the most part. So I'd say maybe 90-95% of the stuff you're going to do, a lot of these you won't ever touch. Okay. So first thing, for emitter, you have different emitter types. So omni emits in all directions. Directional emits in one direction. And you can specify that here, what direction that is. So x0, y1, that means it's going up, right? And once it's directional, I can adjust the spread value, which is over here. So the higher the spread, the less of a straight line it is. So there you go. 2.2, 2.5, right? So there are others. We can cover these a bit later. I'll put this back to Omni for now. Okay. And rate is the number of particles created by the emitter per second. So right now it's set to 100. That means every second, 100 frames are being created. And if I go back here to my settings, you'll see the frame rate is set to 24 FPS. So that means every 24 frames, 100, give or take, 100 particles are created. So I can put this up, let's say 1,500. So you have a lot more, or 5,000 there. Now, this is a great way to crash your computer if you have all this stuff that's too high, right? So be very careful when you're working with dynamics because it's very processor intensive. If I put something like 50,000, you'll see you're going to get a lag really quickly, like so. Okay. And if I select the particle itself, I can go and look at count. I now have 210,416 particles in my scene in 100 frames. So let's just turn this down a little bit. Maybe just say 5,000. Okay, there we go. Okay. Another thing to remember when you're working with dynamics is you're not supposed to scrub, right? You know, if you do animation, you tend to scrub to see if it's correct or not. Doesn't work with dynamics. See what happens? Again, that's because it's computed every frame. So if I'm scrubbing, I'm actually skipping frames, so the computation is now incorrect. So always rewind and play forward again. Okay. Some of these other settings we can get to. So speed. Speed is how fast the particle is traveling once it emerges from the emitter. So let's bring this down a bit, say 1.5. And that is a speed of 5. If I say 2, there. But you'll notice it forms a pretty much perfect sphere, right? So I can say speed random. So with the speed set to 2, and if this were set to 0, every particle created gets a speed of 2. Okay, but if I put anything other than 0 in the speed random, each particle will get 2 plus or minus whatever value I put here. So in this case, 2 plus minus 1, a particle will randomly get assigned a value anywhere between 1 and 3 because that's 2 plus minus 1. So if I play this back, you see, it's not a perfect sphere anymore. Some are faster, they get out. Some are slower, they don't get that far out. See, usually better to have some randomness in what you're doing. It looks less CG. Okay. Skipping ahead to the nucleus, you have gravity, which we've seen, wind speed, wind noise. Um, Time attributes, you can set a start frame. So if I say frame 50, I rewind it, it will not start until it hits frame 50, right? So all these frames before 50, nothing's happening. Once it hits frame 50, you see the particles are created. So that's a way of controlling when your simulation starts, right? So if you don't need it to start at the beginning of the shot, then you can adjust this. You also have scale for the particles. This actually doesn't matter so much, but later on when you get to end cloth, um, this is a useful setting. Basically, what all this means is for every grid, Maya will look at it as 1 meter by 1 meter with a space scale of 1. If I set this to, let's say, zero point 0.5, each grid is half a meter by half a meter. Okay, so that's all that means. And as far as solver attributes up here, substeps of 3, substeps, you can usually just leave them as is, or if you need to turn them up, you turn them up slightly, because this just means the number of times a computation is run in between frames. So with a substep of 3, in between frames, it runs 3 computations. If I turn this up to say 5, okay, it will run more computations. You'll get a more accurate result, but it will be a lot slower. Okay, because it's running all those additional computations. Okay, going to the particle now. Uh, yeah, particle over here, particle shape. We've seen count. Lifespan controls how long the particles live. Okay, live forever is the default, and most times you don't want that. If I set this to constant with a lifespan of 1, that means they all live for 1 second and 1 second only, right? And they all have a constant value. So all particles get a lifespan of 2. If I set this to random range, just like with the speed, I can set a randomizing value. So 0.5. So now the lifespan is 2, give or take zero point 0.5. So each particle can get a lifespan value anywhere between 1.5 and 2.5. Okay, so you'll see now some of them are dying further out, some of them are dying closer in. So if I bring up this value, it should become more apparent. See, some are dying all the way out there, some are dying like just closer to the core. They're dying out already. Okay, again, adding a bit of randomness always helps. Okay, particle size, not such a big deal right now. I'm not going to go through everything. Okay, just the more basic ones, the ones you'll always be using. Okay, you have your dynamic properties. Again, most of the time you don't really adjust this. Conserve is something you would want to adjust. Default is 1. You can go lower. You can't really go higher than 1. Okay, and what the conserve does is it lessens the acceleration of your particles. It's a bit um it's a bit technical, okay? But I just think of it this way. If you're in a void, if you're in outer space, right, and there's nothing there, the particles are moving. There's nothing stopping them. So they're gonna go at a certain speed, right? And they're never gonna stop. Okay. The lower you put your conserve, the more energy a particle loses per frame. See, so it doesn't get very far out. Okay. So watch what happens. There's a bit of a burst and then they slow down. That's because of the conserve value. Whereas if it's 1, they just emit at a certain speed and just keep on going. Okay. Now particles will slow down even if this conserve is set to 1. Because in the nucleus, you have, where is that? Here you go. You have an air density value. So you're not actually working in space or in a void because there's air density and this slows down your particles. But this happens to every particle system in the nucleus. Okay. If you want different sets of particles to behave differently, you would adjust their conserve values. Okay, let's close that for now. And these you can skip. We can go on to shading. Okay, this is where you can have uh, different ways of displaying your particles. So these are divided into different render engines. So the first batch points all the way up to streak will render, okay, with Maya's hardware render. Blobby, Cloud, and Tube, the ones with SW at the end. These will only render with Maya's software renderer. Okay, so points is a point, right? Multi-point is a bit of a cheat. For every point there is, it turns into a cluster of points. Then you can control how many points there are and how far apart the cluster is, right? I say it's a cheat because they're not computed as individual particles, right? If I go to my emitter, you'll see this. If I have like 5 particles only, like that, and I turn up, I turn up my radius. See, they're still simulated as if they're a single particle. It's just that they render with more particles. You can use it to fake some effects. Yeah. But basically, it's a bit of a cheat. I can turn my rate back up. So 150. There you go. Right. Next, you'll have numeric. No, sorry. Let's go with streaks first. Okay. So streaks are the same as points, except that they have a bit of a tail. Right. You see that there. And the tail depends on the speed that they're going at. You can lengthen the tail to exaggerate it, right? So there you go. Those are streaks. And of course, you have multi-streak as well. Okay, so there we go. We can turn the radius down. There we go. And you also have numeric. So these show you numbers. These are good if you want to debug something. Because when you get further in, there are expressions or little bits of code. You might need to know the particle ID or how fast something is going, right? So I can type, right now it's particle ID. I can type velocity, right? And that's the velocity of any given particle at any given time. Okay, we've done points. Spheres just give you spheres. Sprites are a special kind of particle. They're squares that always face the camera, you see? And they're very useful when you want to put pictures on them. Okay. So blobby surface and cloud, no one ever really uses these anymore. Tubes are useful. They're kind of like streaks, uh, and they come with a radius 0 and 1, and then a tail size. Okay, so I can turn the radius down, let's say zero point 0.2 and zero point 0.2, and I can turn up the size like that. Or let's say 0.05, 5.05. Okay, and just like streaks, the faster these go, the longer the tails are. So let's say a speed of 15. See, there they go. And again, you can always adjust, right? And I can play around with this. I can add a bit of gravity, say 5. So you have something like fireworks or sparks.